In 1990, after a sudden cardiac event, Joyce Mikal-Flynn was dead for 22 minutes. While CPR and determined doctors returned her to life, she came to find that this new life wasn't her life at all. Faced with depression, personal and professional setbacks, she ultimately recognized that this was not an endpoint, but a beginning. And we were joined by Dr. Joyce Mikal-Flynn. Welcome back to Writing with Authors. I am Vincent A. Lancey, and thank you for tuning in today. Trauma and crisis are inescapable aspects of life. Framed at times as something to get over, trauma never really leaves those who experience it. And I bring on Dr. Flynn today, who is the author of Anatomy of a Survivor, Building Resilience, Grit, and Growth After Trauma. If you've experienced trauma or a loved one has, similar to me, this is the episode for you. Allow me to now introduce Dr. Joyce Mikal-Flynn. Joyce, thank you so much for joining today.
Well, no, thank you for having me. It really means a lot to me that I can share not only my story, but what evolved as a result of the trauma that I went through, and share that with other people and the research behind it and all that. So thank you.
I'm happy to bring you on. Joyce actually joined me for an episode on a mental health break. So those of you who haven't caught her episode there, stay tuned for that. And as always, we make time for these shows on different coasts, and we always find a way. Joyce, please give yourself an introduction to our audience without giving away too much of your writing endeavors.
Okay, so clinically, I am a nurse practitioner in family practice. I am also a professor at Sacramento State University in California. The work that I do, the research that I've been involved in is involved in trauma-informed care, but my expertise and my specialty is in post-traumatic growth and building resilience in the aftermath of trauma. So that's where I've been involved in, that research I've been involved in for the last couple of decades.
And you've made substantial strides. I've had the chance to check out some of the work you do. But for today's episode, we're going to focus on this book. Let's hear more about it. Teach our audience what we need to know.
So it is actually kind of interesting that I had an opportunity to write this book last summer. So a lot of people had a lot of downtime because of the COVID-19 situation, and that gave me a unique opportunity to put pen to paper and really put down over what I've been dealing with and researching and thinking about over the last 2 decades for this book. So I had an opportunity last summer to write this book. And so I feel specifically or uniquely able to write this book because I have had an experience myself, but I took that experience and again, found out some things about the aftermath of trauma and what people can do with it, and then put also the science toward what does build resilience and what does move people through a growth experience in the aftermath of trauma.
You mentioned this science. I know a little bit about your background. I know you created a course actually based on this science at Sac State. Let's give a little more information on this science for our audience.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that, well, I'll just go back and, relate the fact that I did have this experience, as Vince talked about, early on in my career as a nurse practitioner. And as I was coming through this aftermath of a death experience, I just was so frustrated in how everybody always pointed everything in the negative. And I was constantly being told what I couldn't do instead of what I could. That generated me to think about this. And not overnight, but over time, I found that although there were a lot of things that were taken away, there were a lot of aspects to my life that got better. And my life improved in a lot of ways because of exactly what had happened to me. So I wanted to study that. The more I studied it, the more I saw it in other people, patients I took care of. And there were just a lot of pieces that I thought I need to know more about this. So I actually did get into the study of the neurobiology of resilience and growth in the aftermath of trauma, the applied behavioral science of using what we know to actually work with people in the aftermath. And also I got very interested in the genetic aspect of this. So there's concepts around passing trauma from one generation to the next. And I thought, well, can you pass resilience from one generation to the next? So those are the basic areas of science that I got myself involved in and got other people who I know involved in, and they help support the work that's in the book.
Well, thank you for taking the time to share all that. Our listeners got a little smarter just through the episode as well. Now, you mentioned you had the time during COVID. You had some free time to write this book. Is that what led you to becoming a published author, simply having the time? Or was this something that was always in the works?
Well, this is my second book. I actually wrote my first book called Turning Tragedy into Triumph several years ago. And what prompted me is through my doctoral work, I found out a lot of things about post, and I created a clinical pathway called Metahabilitation, Metahab, that involves stages in moving forward and really what supports people to do that. So I'd been thinking about, and a colleague of mine said, you need to write a book. And I said, oh, I don't know if I can write a book. I don't know if I'm smart enough. I don't know if I can get it done. She said, look, this isn't about you. You found out some information that people need to know. You need to write this down so they get it. So that prompted my first book. And then the ability to add to the science and to the work from my first book to put Anatomy of a Survivor out, that's what really prompted me. So the reason the books are there is to be of service to people who have gone through troubling things. And I did the heavy lifting. I helped you with the science and gave you a specific roadmap, a specific clinical pathway to move forward, not only for yourself, but also for your loved ones and clinicians as well.
Well, you certainly are doing a great service by getting this back out into the public, giving some information to people like me who went through a traumatic experience. And for those of you who have gone through it, you'll understand this. There's never enough information you could have on what you're going through to help you resonate a little more with the situation. But you've written 2 books on trauma now. So I'm going to ask you, this is a big question because you're going to have good advice. 2 pieces of advice for fellow authors. You have 2 books of experience. What can you offer our community?
Well, I think the big 2 pieces are, number one, you have to find your focus. So if you have a book you want to put out, make sure you are very focused on what it is you want to do. Do you want to tell a story? Do you want to give information, what it is? And so you want to be very clear about that. The other thing, when you are an author, you realize your name's on the front of that book. So you must take control of everything that's going through that book. The title, the book cover, you need to take control of the editing, the proofreading, all that. You really cannot leave that to other people. If you are doing that, you need to spend the time and the energy to do that. And one last thing too, that I did learn from too, is to just make sure when you're editing your book and proofreading, make sure you do it from page 1 to whatever page you are, because sometimes you write it in sections. You'll write it in sections and then you don't realize it doesn't flow as well. So make sure you do that before you put it out.
2 great pieces of advice. I always enjoy hearing my guest response on this because it's not as easy as picking up a pen and writing. The beginning of my journey, and I have shared this, I had 6 pages, I feel like, for 6 months. I just couldn't get the words to expand. And then eventually, through persistence, I found a way. Please tell our audience how they can find more about you, connect with you, find out all about your great books.
So good. So thank you. So easy to get in touch with me at drjmf.com. That's so for Dr. Joyce Mikal-Flynn. So drjmf.com. You can go to my website. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I give lots of information about what I'm doing at dr.jmf. And then you can also just Google Anatomy of a Survivor, Dr. Joyce Mikal-Flynn, and it'll come up as through Post Hill Press, and which is a division of Simon & Schuster. So you'd be able to find the book on that website.
Thank you for taking the time to share that. Our listeners certainly heard and saw all the value from you today. So thank you so much, Joyce, for joining for an episode. To our audience out there, thank you so much for tuning in for another week. We're going to ask Joyce for her last word.
So I think my last words are survive, adapt, amaze. That's sort of the tagline for my Metahab company. And the deal is, as I look at that, you have to go through a process. You first survive, then you adapt and adjust. And then over time, you can grow, you can amaze. So you got this.
An amazing last word, Joyce. Thank you so much again. And for everyone viewing on, we will see you next week on Writing with Authors. Bye, Joyce.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.